I have the wonderful privilege also of introducing our fantastic leader of the University of Akron, Dr. Gary L. Miller. He's been the University of Akron's 18th president as of October 2019. He earned his bachelor's and master's degree from the College of William & Mary and his PhD in biological sciences from Mississippi State University. Dr. Miller served as Dean of the College of the Pacific and as Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs and Research at Wichita State University. He served as Chancellor of the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, and then as Chancellor of the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay. It's a true honor and privilege to get to work with him and to welcome him to the podium, President of the University of Akron, Dr. Gary Miller.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to the University of Akron. If you haven't been here before, take a look out on the Coleman Commons and you'll see our students out there relaxing. I was told by a faculty member earlier today that an alarming number of students called in sick today. And so you can see that we favor outdoor recuperation, so that's where the... But it's a great honor to be here with you for the University of Akron, Ohio Economic Forum. I want to give a special welcome and thanks to our panelists who are here, and particularly to Dr. Michael Hicks from Ball State University, our keynote speaker. We're glad to have Dr. Hicks with us to share his perspective on international trade in Northeast Ohio. Also, I want to thank our sponsors of the Ohio Economic Forum, including our gold sponsor, Epiphany Management Group, and our silver sponsors, Harbor Light Wealth Advisors, Nestle, and Timken. We're so grateful for the support of this event, but everything else that these great businesses do for our university and this community. And I know there are some representatives from the city and here, and perhaps from the county. I didn't see you when you came in, but if you're here, welcome. And again, we appreciate our partnership with the City of Akron and Summit County. I think I saw Representative Casey Weinstein here. Is Casey, stand up over there. Thank you for your support. We really appreciate everything you do for us. We also have two members of the University of Akron Board of Trustees with us. Brian Williams is here. Where's Brian? There it is. Stand up, Brian. People need to see you coming on. Right. And I think over here, Tom Waltemeyer is with us here. The University of Akron has a fantastic board who's fully engaged, and it's a great pleasure to work with them. I'm happy they're here today. I also want to thank the faculty and staff of the College of Business. I'm particularly appreciative of the Department of Economics, who initiated this annual community-oriented forum, and which is focused on economic issues that matter to Ohio. The department and the college produce high-quality business students with skills and understanding necessary to accept leadership roles in organizations, private and public, that have an international and global focus. And our undergraduate and graduate programs are ranked in Ohio and nationally. We're very proud of them. This is why, as an urban research university, located in a region with a long history of industries and company engaged in international trade, that we think it's very, very important to have a business school that has a focus and an interest in international business. So as everyone who's in here is aware, international business and international trade are big drivers in the Ohio economy, and the impact is felt every day on industries in this region. I also want to say that we're very proud of the way this school and the rest of the university prepares students for jobs in this community and elsewhere in Ohio. We hope they stay in Ohio. A lot of this has to do with our approach to hands-on learning and our emphasis on global fluency to prepare students to work not only in Ohio, but anywhere in the world, and in Ohio with anybody in the world. And this is an effort that we know also extends beyond the College of Business. For example, in Northeast Ohio, we're very much a part of the Northeast Ohio Polymer Industry Cluster, which is very important to us because the University of Akron is the #1 ranked university in the world in plastics and polymer engineering. So we are very happy for you to be here. This is a very important event for us, and I hope that your meeting is successful and that you have successful networking. But most importantly, I hope that you'll learn a lot about the University of Akron, come back and visit us, engage with our faculty, and engage with our students as they become prepared to work in Northeast Ohio in the global economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Miller. I'd like to take a moment now to introduce a truly remarkable colleague, Dr. Sucharita Ghosh. Dr. Ghosh is a professor of economics and the chair of our department here at the University of Akron College of Business. She earned her Bachelor's of Arts degree in economics from the University of Bombay in India, and her master's and doctoral degrees in economics from the University of Kansas. So rock chalk, that was a rough march for you. Her research focuses on the international aspects of trade, immigration, employment, and growth, as she has published articles in highly ranked journals such as the Journal of International Economics, Oxford Bulletin of Economics, and Statistics and Research Policy. Dr. Ghosh has received the University of Kansas's Chancellor's Award to a graduate student, Teachers for Excellence in Teaching, the Buchtel College of Arts and Sciences Teaching Award, and the College of Business Dean's Excellence in Research Award. She also enjoys the rare distinction of having twice received the prestigious Fulbright Research Scholar Award, first in 2006 and again in 2018. On each occasion, she traveled to Italy to share her expertise in international trade. Those are my written notes on Sucharita. What I want to share with you personally about her. This event is something that was her brainchild, and she does an extraordinary amount of heavy lifting and work putting this together. I often have to chastise her and tell her to start leaving campus before 9 p.m. She is an extraordinary person and truly one of the most professional and dedicated people with whom I've ever worked, both in terms of her dedication to her research, to her staff and faculty in the Department of Economics, and of course to our students. It is really a privilege and honor to work with her. She put a lot of time and effort into this event, and I am personally really proud of her, and I know I share that sentiment with my colleagues in the College of Business. Please give her a warm welcome to the podium.
Thank you, RJ. That was, I'm touched. Well, good afternoon. On behalf of the Department of Economics in the College of Business, I welcome all of you to our Ohio Economic Forum this year. I see many familiar faces from last year, so thank you for returning back this year. I also see Shamus Malik in the audience. Good luck in your run for Akron Mayor. It's coming up soon. Economics has a long tradition at the University of Akron, with economics being part of the university's original curriculum when the university was founded in 1870 as Buchtel College. We then became an independent department in the College of Arts and Sciences in 1956. We moved to the College of Business in 2016, where we joined the departments of Accounting, Finance, Management, and Marketing. With 16 majors and 16 minors in the College of Business, we all have a shared mission of providing a real, experiential, and transformative learning experience through high-quality applied academic programs, thought-leading research, engaging professional development, and meaningful community connections. Today's event is just one example of how we connect to the broader Northeast Ohio community. As we begin this afternoon's session, I want to reiterate our goal for our annual Ohio Economic Forum, which is to focus on Ohio's economy and to have a dialogue on economic issues that matter to Ohio. We want to discuss what economic policies work in Ohio, what economic policies do not work, and what economic policies can drive us forward. This year's topic, International Trade Realities in the 21st Century in Ohio, touches on a topic which some people embrace while others view cautiously. This may be due to the fact that in Ohio, manufacturing employment has declined by approximately 30% since the beginning of the 21st century. This trend coincides with China's accession to the World Trade Organization and the acceleration of automation. However, at the same time, Ohio currently has the highest concentration of foreign-owned factories per 1,000 square miles among the 10 largest states in the country. In fact, there are only 3 other states that are home to more foreign-owned factories than Ohio, and those are California, Texas, and Florida. All of these facts leads us to this afternoon's discussion, where we will try to piece together how international trade and international investment has impacted Ohio and how we can leverage this going forward to increase Ohio's growth. So we will set the tone for this afternoon's discussion with a brief presentation on the regional effects of import competition by Dr. Mike Dedad. Dr. Mike Dedad is an assistant professor in our department. He joined us in 2020 after completing his PhD in economics at Indiana University, Bloomington. Prior to graduate school, Mike worked as a research assistant at the Federal Reserve Board of Governors in Washington, D.C., in the Division of International Finance. Where is Mike? Mike, here you are. The floor is yours. So I'm going to leave you to your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ghosh. So I'm going to very briefly discuss this topic that I've been researching, which is the regional effects of import competition. So the issue is that economic theory typically says that trade benefits a country as a whole, but the reality is that this is in terms of net benefits, which means that there are losers from trade within the country. And not only that, but the losers from trade are not evenly distributed throughout the country. So that's the issue. Some regions are more negatively affected than others. So a famous paper on this from 2013 by Otterdorn and Hansen was called the China Syndrome, and this graph was one of their main motivating observations for their work. And so in this graph, we can see this, I'm not sure if you can see the colors well there, but the solid line is what's called the China import penetration ratio, and this is basically measuring the extent to which Chinese imports have come into the US market over time. And what we can see here is that that has increased from 1987 through 2001 at a pretty steady pace, and that this pace increased even further following 2001 when China joined the World Trade Organization. So at the same time, we can see this dashed line, which is manufacturing employment in the US to the population ratio, and this has declined over the same period. Okay, so this is hinting that there might be a connection between rising Chinese import penetration and declining US manufacturing employment. So that was their observation. Then they ran a bunch of tests and they got these results that regions more exposed to import competition from China have reduced wages, increased unemployment, reduced labor force participation, and increased welfare payments, none of which are very beneficial to a local economy. So that was a really influential paper, and a number of papers came after that to further look at the effects of rising Chinese import penetration in the US market. And they found that regions more exposed to import competition from China experienced decreased mental and physical health, increased workplace injuries, lower fringe benefits, higher household debt, and even decreased marriage and fertility rates, again, none of which are very positive for a local economy. So because this is the Ohio Economic Forum, I prepared some graphs that are Ohio-specific. So this graph is the same idea as the first one I showed you. The blue line here, or the solid line, however you see it, is the same prior to 2007 as what I just showed you, but I've extended it to 2018. And so what we see is after 2007, this line continued going up at a pretty steep rate until about 2010, when it kind of plateaued, and it was relatively constant from 2010 to 2018. At the same time, we have the dashed line, which this time is Ohio-specific manufacturing employment to population ratio. And we see that prior to 2007, it has basically mirrored the national trend of declining manufacturing employment. And then after 2007 until about 2010, that continued. But in 2010, it started to rebound and rebounded all the way through 2018, which is a positive thing, right? And it also coincides in 2010 with this year when Chinese import penetration basically plateaued. So it was headed in the positive direction around 2018, but we can see that even in 2018, it's still much lower than it was in the year 2000. Okay. In terms of wages in the manufacturing sector, so the data here start in 2007. Again, the solid line is the China import penetration ratio, as before. We see that it had this steep increasing trend here from 2007 till about 2010. We see the plateauing. But the dashed line in this case is real manufacturing wages in Ohio specifically. So this is controlling for inflation. And this declined considerably from 2007 to 2010, bottoming out at $22.32 in 2012 dollars in the year 2010. But then in 2010, it reversed directions, right? Here we see that it increased or had an increasing trend from 2010 to 2018. So again, it headed in a positive direction over that span, but we can assume, based on the previous graphs, that maybe it's not where it was in the year 2000, but it is, at least in 2010, at 2007 levels. In terms of workforce participation in Ohio, what economists call labor force participation, this is interesting in the sense that, so this is the dashed line. From 1991 through 2007, this China syndrome period, it actually had an increasing trend, right? More people, or a greater percentage of those able to join the workforce were in the workforce. But this dropped off sharply after 2007, hadn't rebounded as of 2018, but the timing of this doesn't quite match up with the China syndrome story, so this might more be an effect of the global financial crisis and the Great Recession. So this brings me to the research I'm working on. So currently I'm working on answering this question, which is, does lower income caused by import competition result in higher consumption of cheaper, lower quality imports? So I'm basically taking those facts from before, those observations that have been established about the association between rising import penetration from China and reduced wages, and taking it a step further to look at the effects on consumption. And the idea here is that as import penetration increases and wages decrease, are people increasingly effectively forced to buy cheaper, lower quality imports? And not only that, but in doing so, do they unintentionally lead to further negative effects for their local industries? Does this lead to further declines in wages? Does this lead to further increases in consumption of cheaper foreign imports? So that's the question. My expectation is the answer to the question is yes. I'm currently working with the data to test that theory and to quantify it. But in a previous research project, I found that somewhat related. In terms of consumption, within the past couple of decades, there have been growing differences in food taste across regions of the US. And if I show in my current research that there's a connection between rising import penetration from China and consumption, then it might be the case that this is a driving force for these regional or growing regional differences in food tastes that I've previously shown in previous work. So that's a quick preview of what I'm working on. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them after the event. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. So it is my utmost pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Michael Hicks. Mike Hicks is the George and Francis Ball Distinguished Professor of Economics and Director of the Center for Business and Economic Research at Ball State University, which he has led for 16 years. He holds an undergraduate degree in economics from Virginia Military Institute and master's and doctoral degrees from the University of Tennessee. He has held faculty and research center leadership positions at the Air Force Institute of Technology, Marshall University, and the University of Tennessee. His research focus is primarily on the location, size, and composition of households and businesses. These questions involve economic geography, public policy, and quality of place. He has authored 3 books, over 50 scholarly papers, and several hundred technical studies. Dr. Hicks is best known for research on the role of automation and trade on labor markets, healthcare outcomes, and local economic vulnerability. His current research is focused on the quality of life and how it plays a role in household and business location decisions. His research has been reported in such places as The Economist, The Atlantic, Rolling Stone, Vanity Fair, Slate, Wall Street Journal, The New York Times, The Washington Post, NPR, CNN, C-SPAN, CNBC, Fox Business, and the Nightly Business Report. There were more. I decided to edit a little bit. So without much ado, may I present to you Dr. Michael Hicks. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks so much. It's good to be with you all. This is quite a lovely June day that we've convened here. I appreciate you coming. I just want to say at the outset, thank you, Dr. Ghosh. Thank you, Dean. You may not be apparent to all of you here in Akron, but there are very few rewards in academia for caring about the community that you live and work in, and that the Scooby snacks that we get to make us distinguished professors don't come from making the local economy robust. And so the fact that this university and this college is actually pushing research in that area is atypical of what we normally see. So thank you, and I think you all should be proud of that. I'm going to talk to you about trade. After that lovely setup by Mike, I'm going to talk to you about automation, and I'm going to talk to you about the economy here in Northeast Ohio. And I just want to say in the presentation that I'm going to talk through, all the pictures are generated by artificial intelligence. All right, that's my automation gig. The slides are mine. That's simulated intelligence. At least that's what my colleagues suggest. And the dates that I start and end the data are really for convenience of the data availability, and so as not to cloud it from changing definitions. I'm not trying to tell a particular story because there are some differences in the story. It's not a clear, concise, unique story that I'm about to tell. Another thing I want to warn you about is I'm going to give some tough information about this region. You're going to see some slides that hurt, but that's not the end of the story. The end of the story is going to be pretty hopeful, I think. And so just bear with me when I give you some ugly slides about what's been going on here. So if I'm going to talk about trade, I have to begin with Adam Smith, and I'll let you read his great initial statement on it. So this 1775 allegory about making wine in Scotland and linen in Portugal drove David Ricardo to write about trade, and it's been the story that economists have been telling for 250 plus years. It's right, okay? We organize our families around trade. We do things that we're better at and trade off duties with one another. We organize our businesses around trading skills that we're better at or worse off. The United States is the first free trade zone in the world. The Interstate Commerce Clause in our Constitution implies that, demands that of us. So much of our economic vitality comes from being a free trade zone. There's no tariffs when you want to buy something from Indiana or you want to sell it to Michigan. But there's more to the story. And the story begins with the benefits to trade. What has trade done to Ohioans? And sort of hearkening to the work that that he's working on now with much more refined data. This is the share of personal consumption expenditures over the past 25 years spent on 2 different types of goods or services. The first, the red line, are those that are imported. or could be imported. They're exposed to import. So manufactured goods primarily, but some financial services, maybe movies and software. The other one is the share of household spending on goods that you have to buy locally, right? Healthcare, education, doggy daycare. I could name a million different things that you spend your money on. And this pattern is played out around the country. Are we buying less imported goods? Well, heck no. We just saw from the slides that Mike showed, we're buying a lot more just from China. Everybody else is now, a third of US GDP is tied up coming across borders. It's that the price of it is so much lower. So for an individual person in Ohio or Indiana or Tennessee, that's about $2,500, $2,700. It's hard to know for sure because we don't know how much more physical goods are coming across the border. So for the family of 2.3, you do the math, that's $5,000 to $6,000 in additional benefits from trade. But is that distributed equally, as Mike attended to? Does everybody benefit from trade the same way? I benefit from trade a lot, right? And I'm in a highly tradable sector. Education is highly tradable, but not everybody benefits from it. So what's happened to jobs in tradable sectors? This is Ohio jobs, and these are manufacturing jobs. Those are the biggest tradable sector. We actually run a net export of services. A lot of that's education, software, other things like that. But just in manufactured goods in Ohio, the red dots are those that are losing jobs. The number of jobs are on the horizontal axis, and the vertical axis is their average income. The bubble is the change in total income over that time period in millions of dollars. So Ohio's gained some manufacturing jobs over the past, this is 30 years, 20 years, sorry, so far this century. But they're mostly in food, beverage, which are less traded. They're more likely to be produced locally. This is taking the squeak out of pigs, right? This is making peppermint gum and things that are manufactured in the United States and consumed by the US. Has policy had much an effect on this? Yeah, I don't think so. So this is, I separated all the jobs in this 20-county region. I'll show you a picture of it in a minute. Cumulative job growth in two types of jobs. One type of jobs are really exportable jobs, or exportable goods. These are jobs that produce things that can be sold anywhere around the country. And they're sold, they might be consumed a little bit locally, but think anything that's manufactured, except maybe concrete or some food products, is sold somewhere else, either domestically or outside the United States. The other types of jobs are those jobs that attend to people. They rely on local demand for those goods or services. So over the last 50 years here in Northeast Ohio, you've created almost 1 million net new jobs in those people jobs, the jobs that rely on local folks. These are non-footloose jobs. They're going to go to where people are. You're not going to be able to lure them here through business incentives or through tax policy. And you've lost 400,000+ of the other types of jobs. So it doesn't look like public policy is really reversing this job loss. But this doesn't tell us why it's happening. We got a hint of it, the China shock, the China syndrome period that David Autor and his colleagues have written about that Mike just gave you a great rundown for. Let's take a look at what might be some of the causal factors. So what I have done here is I've pulled data from a study that I authored with 3 colleagues at Ball State in 2017, where we have county-level automation exposure. It's the first study of its kind. Brookings did one in 2019. We looked at all the automation all the jobs in the U.S. that had been categorized by their risk of being automated by technology that existed in 2012 and was in commercial application. This was done by 2 economists at Oxford University. And we connected those occupations, the risk of automation all the way down to the county level. And we looked at import exposure. Import exposure is the share of jobs in these tradable sectors that were likely or could potentially have high risk of being imported. And what you can see in the top graph is import exposure at the county level. And you can see as import exposure rose, we saw fewer job losses here in Northeast Ohio. Now, that line doesn't tell you an awful lot. It's a pretty small slope. But there's certainly not a lot of connection between higher risk of import exposure and job losses at the county level here in Northeast Ohio. If you look at manufacturing job losses versus automation exposure, it's a flat line as well. So this suggests automation's hitting everybody equally. There's a little bit of hint that maybe it's unequal, but it's not pointing towards import-related job losses in that upper graphic. And the problem is that probably everybody's losing some jobs to import substitution. That is, jobs are being, what we are making in Northeast Ohio, or if you live in Muncie as I do, those jobs are moving away as they're moving to China or to Japan. The jobs don't really move, the factories don't really move. It's just that the suppliers stop buying your stuff because it's less cost competitive with those that are shipped from elsewhere. At the same time, that puts a great deal of pressure on a firm to automate, to improve its productivity, to cut its costs. So some slice of that automation job losses, or some slice of all the job losses, are going to be affected by trade as well. And so the way you think about it is your factory's told in 1998, we can get this product a lot cheaper in China. Over the next 2 years, you tell your workforce, I'm going to have to cut some of your benefits, we're going to have to cut costs. See that guy in the back who's always hungover, Monday is at work, he's gone, and I don't care what the union says, right? So you shrink your labor force. And over the next 2 or 3 years, you automate that workforce. And the resulting workforce of an automated factory is generally better educated than the incumbent factory. About a third of all those jobs stay in the area. They just go to other sectors. So they're still doing something with manufacturing, but they're not in the factory anymore. Maybe you're outsourcing the cleaning staff, the nursing staff, the HR function, right? So some of those manufacturing job losses are ephemeral. They're not really affecting employment in your region. And then the remaining 2/3 are, again, concentrated amongst the less well-educated folks. If you lose your job to trade, the whole factory goes away. So the distribution of impact of jobs with trade is everybody. The distribution of impact of automation is concentrated amongst poorer, less well-educated workers who are they're not managing the business, they're not maintaining the operations afterwards. And this is why I think this is mostly a story of automation. This is manufacturing GDP loss or increase, and our estimate of the over and undersupply of bachelor degree holders, right? An oversupplied bachelor degree holder, we estimated those that have more bachelor degrees than predicted by industry structure. So the places that are continuing to see GDP growth in your region are those places that have an overabundance of bachelor degree holders. And the places that are shrinking in GDP, and your region has seen GDP in manufacturing shrink over the last 20 years, though it has risen nationwide, are in those places that have an undersupply of bachelor degree holders. So this is a strong argument that automation is the primary culprit here. Again, I'm not discounting the fact that pricing pressure from China or Malaysia or Germany may have driven out some businesses. It may have caused more automation, but it's not really import substitution that's causing the problem. It's more likely automation. And these places that are seeing GDP growth, wages are probably rising in manufacturing. I don't have time to talk about all that. But you saw some of that in Mike's presentation, which we did not coordinate, by the way. I saw it in real time as you all did. So here's my occupation. So I asked ChatGPT last week, what would Adam Smith say about productivity enhancing innovations? And this is what Adam Smith said. I'm not sure I agree with all of it. There's some interpretation of Adam Smith that probably didn't appear in the irregular that I had to read in graduate school. Nonetheless, there's automation for you, taking away economists' ability to interpret Adam Smith. I may be panhandling very shortly. Let's see what this means locally. Let's take a look at some things. And this is the tough slide for the region. So this is cumulative employment growth from a data set called Quarterly Workforce Indicators and IPUMS from 2000 onwards. In the upper left-hand corner is cumulative employment growth by educational attainment for the 4 big adult categories: less than high school, which is the blue line, high school graduates, college graduates, and those who've been to college but don't hold a bachelor's degree. And you can see cumulatively this region has had the biggest share growth has been amongst those without a college degree, without a high school diploma. Big decline of high school graduates. That's one of the sidebars of the automation and reduction of manufacturing, is that it clobbers middle-class jobs. So it's high school graduates and those with an associate's degree or some college. The winners tend to be those with a college degree or some college or very low-level jobs. There's always abundant jobs for people without a high school diploma, right? There are abundant. They're never filled. Right. And so this is probably a supply side issue here in Northeast Ohio. The bottom right is the United States. 72% increase in college graduate jobs over the same period. Right, it's 23 years. Huge increase. These are net increase. Some increase in that gray line, which are those who have some college, and then declines in the other 2 categories. So what we're seeing is very localized employment bifurcation between better higher wage jobs and low wage jobs. This is not an unusual story. This is the story of the Midwest in total, right? So this is not an Ohio or a Northeast Ohio story. It's a story from Tennessee to Michigan, from Iowa east to western New York. And it suggests it mimics the challenges that Mike just talked about: lower labor force participation rate, higher share of welfare payments, lower wages, and then higher mortality and morbidity. This is incumbent with the higher suicide rates and deaths of despair that all of us, I live in urban Muncie, right? So there's only one cornfield between me and my job. And so this is that story written across our neighborhoods. But the story in Northeast Ohio is different than most of the Midwest. And so this is work that I've been doing with Amanda Weinstein. Her work in quality of life is really some of the best that's going on in the country now. I tagged along for the ride, hopefully made it marginally better. And what we do is we look at quality of life without making any assumption about what you all like. Because if it's up to me, every place looks like Kauai, right? So I don't make any assumptions about what people like for weather. What we do is we look at how much more people are willing to pay for a house, a statistically identical house in each county. And that premium tells you that that is a neighborhood or place that people want to live. We know that as a realtor is location, location, location. And then we look at how much people might be willing to pay just a little bit less in order to live in a place that they want to. Same job, same occupation, but they're going to take a little bit of a wage cut to live there. All right, that's harder to envision, but the nicest place that we found in the Midwest is Traverse City, Michigan. And I've never been there, but the story is there you get half the pay for a view of the bay. But that's Traverse City, Michigan. So we combine these two together, right? We subtract that willingness to accept a lower wage from their willingness to pay for a bigger house, and a bigger number gives you higher quality of life. And a lower number gives you lower quality of life. And that map in the upper left-hand corner is the map of the U.S. And having lived in 14 states as an Army officer and the son of a CIA officer, I can tell you that map looks real like the places I lived, either if they were blue and nice or brown and really bad. And any place that has McDowell County, West Virginia is the worst place in the country, and Hawaii is the #1, probably got something right in it. But what's most interesting in our study is that we found the one outlier, just to tell you that this methodology works, is the one outlier that we found in the United States was Harrison, Arkansas. We couldn't figure out what's up with Harrison, Arkansas. We just couldn't figure it out. All the data looked good, temperate weather. This is a typical day there. Airport, nice FedEx facility, four-year university, nice rolling hills. Also national headquarters of the Ku Klux Klan. So we found that in a 3,144 county model, right? So we think it's pretty good. So I pulled out and tried to clean up this map, or I should say my very able graduate student pulled out this map and made me a map that had 3 things on it. The red places are the places that are 1 standard deviation below the national average for quality of life. The gray places are the places that are within 1 standard deviation of the quality of life. So this is the big national average quality of life, some above, some below. And the green places are between 1 and 4.4 times higher than the national quality of life measure. So this is sort of a shocking, I wouldn't have expected that, right? Nobody thinks about that when they think of Akron or Cleveland. But this is what people who live here and people who don't live here say about the area. Right? So I'm going to come back to this because I think this is very important. This is just a snapshot of how far you are above or below, right? And we also can measure quality of business environment, which is you add these two, willingness to pay and willingness to accept together. That gives you how much more businesses are willing to go to here for labor productivity. And everybody's within 1 standard deviation of the mean, above or below. So this is a type of place that in the modern world we might think could grow. And let me just show you that. There's very strong evidence, and this is from a paper that Amanda Weinstein, myself, and Emily Warnell are working on, that in the post-COVID period, there's been an explosion of migratory change due to quality of life. So pre-COVID, quality of life, if you were to go from, jump about 500 places in the quality of life ranking, that would give you about 1 more year of population growth out of every 5 years. So that's a pretty big effect of quality of life. In the 2020 to 2021 data, that's 4 times as large. So going 500 points in quality of life means you're going to go from, you're going to more than double your overall population growth. Now, obviously, there's other factors at play, but that's an important issue here. But the question is why? Why in the post-COVID world would quality of life matter so much more? And here's why. This is from the Census Household Pulse Survey from last month. They've been doing it for about 18 months now, 20 months, as part of the CARES Act. And they asked folks across a whole bunch of domains, are you working remotely? How many days per week do you work remotely? This is Ohio's answer, which is almost identical to the national average, by the way. So just to put it in context, when last I checked, you all had about 660,000 manufacturing jobs. So they're remotely working full-time, just under 600,000 Ohioans with a college degree working remotely in Ohio. There's over 1 million Ohioans working full-time remotely across all categories. That's a big number, by the way. So let's talk about the economic forecast. So doggone Fed yesterday said there's going to be a recession. At least that's what the news said. That's not what my model told me a week ago when I ran these numbers. They have better information than I do, but I'm still not convinced. When I first ran a model last summer of Ohio and Indiana, no recession, deep slowdown in the middle part, second half of this year. We're not yet seeing that, but we're seeing increasing hints of that. The long-term projection through 2024, or longer term, intermediate term, really is improvement back to the sort of 2017 to 2018 growth, which was much better here in the Midwest. By 2019, we're beginning to see some pressures of tariffs, at least in Indiana. But what I think we're going to see is a significant change in quality of life playing out in population over the next generation or longer. And I think the move to remote work, and how many college students do I have here? Raise your hands. All right. So my students that work for me, at least I hope they're working now, they're thinking about majors so that they could work remotely. That's changing their educational plans. And so if you try to think about the type of labor market shock that we've had of this magnitude in the past, the only thing that comes to mind is the baby boom, the great generation coming back from World War II and the Depression, forming families and migrating all around the country for about 30 years. I think that's where we're at now. We're in year 2 of that right now. So we're in the very early stages. And I think there are going to be places that play themselves out. We talked beforehand, Albuquerque is not going to see huge population growth. They don't have any water. So what we've seen nationwide in the Midwest is small to medium-sized metropolitan areas are seeing population growth, right? And here's a picture of that here. So this is the stunning picture. So I have 3 pieces of data, and the far right are population growth relative to Ohio and relative to the US. And then I have employment growth and new business starts. Yellow means you're growing, but you're growing more slowly than the nation. Red means you're growing negative. It's negative, you're shrinking. And the green means you're growing faster than the nation. And I turn your attention to new business starts per 100,000. New business starts in the United States are average about 24 per 1,000 people each year. That's up from about 18 in 2019. So we've seen a huge spike in new business starts. And I don't know what's happening in Stark and Summit counties, right? Now, these are all business start types, not necessarily employers, right? So, and this is over the average over a 3-year period. So we're seeing significant change here. So what I want to leave you with is that this has been a very difficult time. It's important to understand why over the past 20 to 30 years manufacturing jobs have declined and what impact that has had on you, but also to look forward to the types of jobs that you can get both in manufacturing and elsewhere, and the type of educational profile that you would need to arm your incumbent population with in order to take advantage of those opportunities so that they don't go elsewhere. And I just leave you this. There's a scramble on for jobs in chip manufacturing and elsewhere. And this region remains fairly well poised for many of those. And with that, I'll turn it back over to your group. Thank you again to University of Akron for this opportunity. And I hope you all appreciate what you have here in your backyard. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. So we get to the next portion of our program, but before I get into that, you will have, if you did notice, there's one less chair over there, and I just want to share my sincere condolences to Mindy McLaughlin, who was supposed to join us today, but could not because of an unexpected death of her father. So I got the call from her office, and so my sincere condolences to her and her family. So moving on, we do have 3 wonderful panelists with us. So let me begin with Todd Heiser. Todd Heiser joined the U.S. and Foreign Commercial Service as a senior international trade specialist in October of 2008 at the Akron, Cleveland U.S. Export Assistance Center. After working for nearly 18 years in the private sector, He is currently the director for the U.S. Commercial Services covering Northern Ohio, including offices in Cleveland, Columbus, and Toledo. I am literally giving you cliff notes of their bio, okay? So if you need more, scan the QR code on your program brochure and you'll get the full blow up of their life experiences. Jill has more than 13 years of leadership experience with Nestlé. During that time, she has held roles in escalating responsibility in areas of finance, supply chain, and procurement. In her current role, Jill leads the procurement business partner team, supporting the meals division, which is made up of brands that we all recognize. It includes Stouffer's, Lean Cuisine, Life Cuisine, and Sweet Earth. Jill collaborates with the meals leadership team to align the procurement and business strategies for Nestlé USA. Key areas of focus for her are innovation, value creation, and translation of market movement to business impact. Last but not the least, we have Guhan Venkatu. He is the Group Vice President in the Research Department of the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, where he leads the department's Regional Analysis Group. He joined the bank in 1998 as a research analyst. In his tenure with the bank, he has held positions of increasing responsibility, including Vice President and Senior Regional Officer of the bank's Pittsburgh branch. His research and analysis have been a resource for the public and the bank's president and board of directors at the Fed. Finally, our moderator, who is there, is Dr. Ali Anami. Dr. Anami is going to moderate the panel, and he received his PhD in economic analysis and policy from Tulane University in 2018. He joined our department in 2020. By the way, I have a fabulous team. Couldn't do it without them, okay? So he was, prior to joining us in 2020, an associate at Cornerstone Research in San Francisco, where he provided economic and statistical analysis on commercial litigation matters. So I will now let Ali take over from me, and I will step down. So, there you go.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to moderate a panel with such a diverse background in academia, public and private sector experience. I'm going to start our panel with a few questions that I have for our panelists, and that provides time for you all to write down any questions that you have for the panelists, and sometime around 4:10, 4:15, my colleague is gonna come around and collect your questions, and I'm gonna ask your questions from our panelists. So please feel free to submit any questions that you have. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm gonna start with you, Jill. Can you give us some insight into how companies make sourcing decisions in their supply chain, especially with regard to choosing between domestic versus international suppliers?
Sure. So I've spent 23 years working, last 13 at Nestle, in procurement. What I would say overall, and I'm going to speak mostly about my time at Nestle, which has been the last 13 years. But when it comes to Nestle, and when we think about what we're buying, and luckily it's for things like lasagna and mac and cheese, so items that we love, we're looking at not only what suppliers do we want to work with, but our biggest thing is we have really high quality standards. So looking at our high quality standards, ensuring that the suppliers can hit on time, that's another obviously big thing. We're balancing both who are the local suppliers, but also do they have the right capabilities, the right processes, what to meet our high standards that we're looking at. So it's definitely a combination of, yes, we take into account things like growing region. There are some things you just can't source locally. Coffee beans, we don't grow local, so that's not an option. But definitely a combination of where is the item coming from, and how do we ensure on time, in full, right quality to our manufacturing partners.
So you mentioned, a timely deliverance of products as one important factor. So let me just have a follow-up question for you. In the past few years, we have had disruptions in the supply chain due to COVID-19 pandemic. How has that affected the decisions that your company or companies in your industry are making with regard to whether they buy from abroad or source the products inside the US?
Yeah, so I think COVID has had a huge impact. What I would say is we're spending a lot more time on what we call business continuity plans. So it's not just do we have a supplier or do we have two suppliers, but it's also what is our supplier's backup plan? So if something happens, and really making sure we have in-depth conversations with them to understand and vet out what is their business continuity plan. Where are they holding items? Do they have a warehouse? What does that look like? How far away is that? So we're spending a lot more time. What I would say is before COVID, it was really supply outweighed demand. And since then, demand has outweighed supply. So we are definitely spending a lot more time working on strong business continuity plans. And we used to have them, but a lot of times they're written on paper. And now we're making sure that we can quickly enact them, and that not just that they're on paper, but that we've vetted them out.
I see. Well, staying on this question of COVID-19 disruptions, and this question is for you, Mike. Do you think that because of these disruptions, we're going to see a return of manufacturing jobs to Ohio? I know you have done the analysis to some extent about these industries, but do you think the employment in manufacturing industry is going to go up just because of the fact that we have these disruptions?
I think no. So the manufacturing, obviously, after the end of the China shock, recovered a bit, but there was a real stall of productivity between, say, 2010 and 2019. And so that stalled productivity, if you recall Mike's slide where he showed manufacturing in Ohio the last decade or so, was the longest uninterrupted period of manufacturing job growth in the Midwest in any time in history. And so that 2009 to 2019. And so I don't see anything like that unless productivity stalls. What I think is more likely is we'll have higher GDP. I think we'll have a lot of GDP come back. We're going to produce more stuff over the next 10, 20, 30 years than we ever have before. Be record years in U.S. manufacturing production, but we'll be doing so with the same or fewer workers. The type of worker will also change. The only caveat I have to that is if the supply chain disruptions aren't just limited to China, because right now people are moving from China to Vietnam or China to Malaysia. If they're more widespread, you could see, return of some things, but I don't think the U.S. is going to spend a lot of capital trying to get people to do jobs that could be done for $4 an hour somewhere else.
Makes sense. I still want to hear a little bit more about this topic before I move on to other questions I have. We also have the element of inflation. This question is for you, Guhan. Do you think the rising inflation that we have been seeing in the markets, I mean, it's slowing down a little bit now, do you think that would play any role in changing the dynamics between offshoring versus producing the products inside the U.S.?
I think I'm with Dr. Hicks on this. So, I mean, in some sense, you could see some onshoring, but that's going to come. So you might think of the Intel plant as an example, the kind of movement to bring chip production back to the U.S. or have it occur more fully, more expansively in the United States, but that's likely to come at a cost. So the chip production facilities that are outside of the U.S. are maybe it's too strong to say this, but in large measure, in that case and other cases, entities are in the lowest cost locations. Having them come back to the U.S. in this case is really about the security of the flow of those goods, and that might be true in other industries as well. So we might see some local benefits as a consequence of that, but as far as the costs, it should result in higher costs. That's going to be, not disinflationary in that particular case. And it's worth saying too, I mean, so Dr. Hicks talked about China, Dr. Dadad as well. You would have seen costs fall. That would have been keeping inflation down over the period in which we were seeing an increase in imports from China particularly, but more generally globally. So in this case, I would say, there might be kind of local benefits in terms of activity, employment. I think I don't want to overstate that either. From an inflation perspective, I think it's likely to not be beneficial.
Got it. Well, I tried my best. Looks like none of these gonna be having any positive impact on employment in Ohio. So let me move on from these questions and switch to comparative advantage that businesses have in Northeast Ohio. I'm going to come back to you, Mike. What makes Northeast Ohio attractive to global and domestic investors, and what do you think is the potentially biggest misconception about our region?
I think that's an easy question. This is one of the most productive places the world's ever seen, right? Just the ability of GDP per capita is probably, in manufacturing, probably $600,000 a year, right? So it's, in China, it's probably $25,000 a year in part. So it's just an enormously productive place. So this is a great place to come, invest in capital if you can find the right workforce. So there are places where you can find exactly the right workforce. There the supply chain. I mean, we're very proximal to much of the world. We have advanced infrastructure here. And so there are a lot of advantages to being here, but you have to have an industry that really values that extraordinarily productive worker. So we're talking about, extraordinarily high-end stuff. And so that's going to be it's going to be a continual push for education. I mean, in 2007, the average manufacturing worker had been to college. And so the demographic of the average manufacturing worker in 2007 was me, right? An old white guy. And so that means all the people who were young had been to college. And so today you see the biggest growth, really, the Intel plant in Ohio, it's going to essentially be all college graduates. The one in Indiana just announced it's all going to be college graduates. So as long as you can sustain that advantage, and this would be a good place for a lot of college graduates to move to, I think you're fine. But it's not, it's not going to be the industry of 1965. It's going to be the industry of the future. And I think if you're really thinking about that productivity, this is as good as any place in the world.
Thank you. I would love to hear from other panelists if there are other aspects to Ohio and our comparative advantage here. We heard about productivity. We heard about a great number of people with a college degree that we have here, so human capital. Are there any other aspects for our region that would make us very much better than, let's say, the rest of the US in terms of producing products and competing in the global market? Is there anything that you guys would like to add?
I mean, I just offer sort of one thing. I mean, again, Mike sort of mentioned this when thinking about manufacturing and the prospects for manufacturing over the next decade or so. They're unlikely to be, I think, much different from what we've seen over the last decade. So the Labor Department does these projections. So Niels Bohr apparently said prediction is difficult, particularly about the future. Thanks for chuckling. It was either he or Mark Twain. In any event, their projections for the next decade are for manufacturing employment nationally to be essentially flat. And I think that, again, given what we've seen over the last 2 decades, for the various reasons that Mike pointed out, that seems unlikely to really meaningfully change. There are these kind of the supply chain issues, kind of the fracturing in some sense of international trade, which the IMF has warned about just this week, in fact. But in terms of Ohio, so there's the Intel plant, we talked about that as, that's one thing that's positive. There's the LG battery plant. The question for us, given the importance of auto manufacturing in the state, in this part of the country, is what does the electrification of vehicles mean? There's some work out of the Chicago Fed that suggests that you're likely to get a lot of, the footprint of the industry is likely to be very similar to what it is now. Which should be beneficial for us. So you think about the Ford plant in Avon Lake. They announced that they're going to have EV production there. It's going to happen for the Honda plants also. There's the LG plant again, the battery plant to serve those plants. So it seems like from that perspective, we might not have to expect the same sort of erosion in manufacturing activity, some of which, again, has been pointed to over the last couple of decades. But the one thing, again, that's consistent with the other comments that have been made is, given how those vehicles get produced, so in this case, this technological change, it's likely to require fewer employees. So even though auto production may not really leave the area, we might be as invested or largely as invested as we've been in auto production, the production side of it is going to be less labor intensive, again, consistent with sort of what we've seen more generally in the industry.
Makes sense. Thank you. Well, Todd, you have been relatively quiet, so next question is for you. How can we help existing businesses in Ohio grow their business and get a bigger foothold in the international market?
Yeah, thanks for that. I'd like to propose one of the things that we can do to help grow businesses in Northeast Ohio and grow employment is through exporting. I think it's one of those things, I'm sorry, I'm supposed to hold it up closer, but 70% of the world's purchasing power is outside the United States, and 95% of the world's consumers are outside the United States. Yet only about 5% of U.S. small to medium-sized businesses export. And of that group, about 60% of them only export to one market. So in our situation, a lot of them, we export a lot to Canada, whether it's Northeast Ohio or Ohio in general. A big chunk of what we do is exporting to Canada. It may be true in places like Texas, it might be more to Mexico, that kind of thing, but most of these small businesses only export to one market. That contrasts with some of like our European friends. For example, Germany exports 47% of their GDP, where the United States does 12%. So there's a lot of opportunity for growth in the export markets. South Korea does 42% of their GDP in exporting. So it's a big opportunity for a region like Northeast Ohio. Northeast Ohio already is one of the top 8 exporting states, or Ohio in general is one of the top 8 exporting states in the nation, which I think I could win a bet with a lot of you if we just bet on that beforehand. And it's not just big companies. Sure, the Timkens of the world, GE Aviation's, Goodyear, things like that, they export. But there's a lot of small businesses. In Ohio, there's over 232,000 jobs supported by exports. And again, that's with a small percentage of what we're doing being actually in the export market. But we do export over $56 billion worth of goods and services out of Ohio. So again, it's something that we have a lot of room for growth. There are plenty of resources available. I work for the federal government with part of the Department of Commerce International Trade Administration, but there are state of Ohio resources. There are local economic development, whether it's your city, your county, all those type of groups are willing to help your business find customers overseas and grow that business to create jobs and good paying jobs. Those jobs that are supporting those exports are generally higher paying than your standard manufacturing jobs in the U.S.
Makes sense. Thank you. Kind of on the same topic, but let me come to you, Jill. What type of reforms and policies at the federal and the state level would you say are necessary to support U.S. companies, especially companies like yours, to better compete in the international market?
Yeah, so I think anything around manufacturing and how do we get, when it comes to the infrastructure of manufacturing or the labor of manufacturing, help there. Also, making lasagna, and my first job was in tomatoes, so I come from the agricultural side. So you think about labor laws when it comes to things that are harvested. That is a very short period of time that we have to get in those fields and get that food harvested and put away. So laws around that, and obviously tariffs would be the other issue. We've definitely been impacted by tariffs over the last few years.
Got it. But you mentioned tariffs. That kind of brings me to a question that I had for Todd. I think this is now going to be the best time to ask that. We know that the United States has a number of free trade agreements with countries all over the world. How would you say companies, especially small businesses in Ohio, can take advantage of these free trade agreements?
Yeah, thanks for that. I think most of us have heard of NAFTA, which has now been labeled USMCA, and it's been changed a little bit from back in the 80s when NAFTA came around. But these free trade agreements and tariffs can work both directions. So I think it's something that Ohio companies should really look at is the ways to take advantage on the export side is how can they grow their business to our free trade agreement partners, whether it's Mexico and Canada, or we have free trade agreements with 20 different nations, and I always have to bring my notes because even I forget some of them, but like CAFTA, Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, Australia, Israel and Jordan, South Korea. We have lots of different places where It's not just about tariffs when you're talking about free trade agreements either. Yes, it can be tariff elimination to make your products more competitive with those that are made in the local region, which again can sometimes hurt on the import side. But you can take advantage of that with your business and being more competitive in the foreign markets. But it also gives us access to better protection for intellectual property. So those either maybe high-tech things that have patents or trademarks or those type of things. Part of the free trade agreement negotiations are protecting intellectual property, not just about tariffs. It's also about ability to bid equally on government procurement projects, things like that. Fair treatment for U.S. investors if you're looking to invest in those markets. So those are also a lot of benefits from free trade agreements that are going the other direction that can help us grow our businesses here in Northeast Ohio and grow, the jobs ultimately as we continue to grow those businesses.
Makes sense. I want to change gears a little bit, and we've been talking about businesses and international trade. There are other stakeholders that are affected by international trade. I want to address this question to Mike, actually. We know that the trade adjustment assistance for workers was terminated in the July of 2022, basically less than a year ago. What programs still exist or should exist to help reduce the negative effect of free trade on workers?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that we've had trade adjustment assistance since the 1980s at sunset. There was a bill introduced in 2018 by Senator Donnelly and Senator Gillibrand and Senator Peters from Michigan to introduce the Trade and Automation Adjustment Assistance Act, which would give both income support for people who were displaced and then educational support to retrain them. So I have a good friend who went from a factory to being the IT director at a local community college through that Trade Adjustment Act. Well, that one didn't pass, it's gone. And so what's happened is, as David Autor wrote about in the slides that Mike put up, was that instead of having this temporary assistance for workers, retooling them for a new job, they ended up mostly going on Social Security disability. They took food stamps, and I'm a disabled veteran, so I can do my job without the disability payments, so I'm not criticizing them. But the fact is that usually is part of the depressing of labor force participation rates. So people got on Social Security disability and didn't re-enter the formal labor force. So we have a safety net, but the safety net doesn't promote the objectives of having more people work, be more productive, increase GDP per capita, provide workers to businesses that need them right now. And so I think a functioning Congress, it's a dream of mine, a functioning Congress would handle both the immigration, which would handle not just the seasonal, but the other issues, and also provide some sort of assistance. So these people who were working productively, lost their job at 53, they couldn't move because their husband or wife still had a job, they want to work, and they went on disability, but they would have been willing to work another decade, and now they're just out of the labor force. That is just not smart policy, and it's bad politics, and that's the first thing I think we could think about doing.
Thank you. Anyone else would like to contribute to that?
Maybe just to build on that, if I heard Mike correctly, and building on the other comments as well. If you think about, Intel, I mentioned Intel, I'm sure it's on the minds of many in the room. There was state assistance that was provided, of course, for that plant. It's kind of true generally across the country. We saw it with Amazon, the second headquarters thing. So this kind of incentive race is the way that states, other sub-state areas try to compete for businesses to attract them to their regions. But there's work that's been done that suggests that the higher return on investment initiatives are really related to human capital, but also kind of more directly reaching out to businesses to help them access new markets, do things of that sort. So in this part of the country, I think there's kind of an argument to be made for thinking about strengthening the entities that are here, working with them more actively. That's true both on the business side and the household side. So thinking about training programs, I think the record there is mixed, but the point is trying to strengthen the position of incumbent businesses and workers is often maybe a higher return activity, investment, than what's typically happening with incentives across the country. And of course, that incentive, the work that's happening on incentives is, back to the human capital point that Mike and others were making. It's, as people at this university and others across the state know, that's taking money out of the both primary, secondary, post-secondary education systems, which is really kind of the key to our longer-term viability and prosperity.
Makes sense. Thank you. So I believe I've touched on businesses, I've touched on workers. I believe there is one more stakeholder we want to hear about it from you guys, and that's the communities that these businesses are located in. And this question is for you, Todd, but I'm going to ask everyone to please contribute. Is it possible for businesses to be successful, especially, on the international market, which sometimes may require to offshore their manufacturing, but also still contribute to the well-being of the residents of the region that they are operating in?
Yeah, I think they're definitely hand in hand. Before I joined the Commerce Department, I worked and ran a small business for the last several years of the 18 years I was there. And we were able to grow our business doing international trade. We were also hurt, to be frank about it, with NAFTA in the beginning because of the competition, having stuff manufactured in Mexico. But I think one of the unseen benefits that's not necessarily a financial benefit is that as a small business, we had about 30, 35 employees who didn't know anything really about the rest of the world. That we hadn't been really selling except for Canada and maybe a little bit to Mexico. But then when we started putting a map up and saying, look, we're selling to the United Arab Emirates, we're selling to South Korea, we're selling to, they started learning about that type of thing. So it also built the education of more of a global network or a global feeling that, hey, we're in the global economy, being a small business in Parma, Ohio, that you could drive by 100 times and never think that we were selling 25% of our products overseas. And I do that now as part of the Commerce Department. I meet with these small businesses all the time. And you could drive in Akron, you can drive even in the rural areas. One of my best clients is down in Navarre. And they're literally in a cornfield, and they sell 60% of their business overseas. They have international buyers coming into their plant all the time from all over the world. So it's really benefiting the community to see outside of their little bubble, or our little bubble, in Northeast Ohio. We're so used to doing business with each other, with maybe the Midwest, maybe the US, maybe a little bit with Canada, but then when you start seeing buyers coming in from around the world, it really kind of builds on that community to look outside of our community as a global population.
Makes sense.
I like to take a jab at it. One way to think about this is to ask yourself, why is manufacturing in the Midwest now? Why are we the manufacturing hub in the United States? When in 1900 it was New England. And the real reason is not the waterways, it's not the natural resources, it was the people, right? That at the time when farms became too productive to support all the people that were here, the Northwest Territory, those 5 states had all required their constitutions to have education in them. So Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Ohio, everybody by the time they were 14 or 15 could read or write. Probably we here, this county, had universal literacy before Great Britain, right? So that's why people came here. And so today we're facing the sort of same thing. The factories that are here, either here because they've been here a long time, or if they're moving here like the Intel plant because Ohio State was there, right? And I don't like Ohio State very much, sorry. But it brought you that, and being from Indiana, we really hate it after we lost that plant. The fact is that's why they're there. So I think the conversation, it's really obvious why businesses help communities. I think it's so obvious. It's so clear. But I would encourage business leaders to have tough conversations with elected officials about the quality of schools, the quality of life, the things that would bring the people here that you want. And if you really want to have a partnership in advancing the community, you have to realize all those tax incentives that you get take money right out of the pockets of some other entity that people value in that local region. And I'm not saying don't take them, but just remember that's where they're not being printed at the Fed. Right? And so that's really an issue. So I would encourage a much deeper conversation about the long-term success of a place. And that's what I'm trying to encourage in Indiana and elsewhere, that that's really where the relationship has to go. And you can see right now, if you were going to invest $1 in bringing capital, I be honest, I don't think a dollar of that, Ohio's incentives mattered for that plant. They were there because they could get the engineer and the labor that they needed. But boy, you could sure use that money in schools and reworking water sewer systems, improving your roads, and reclaiming some of the Great Lake area that would be a huge attraction to people throughout the rest of the century.
Makes a lot of sense. Thank you. I'm going to ask my colleagues to slowly bring me the questions from audience. I'm getting to the end of questions that I have here. One more, though, for Guhan. This is for you. So we know that international trade has affected the manufacturing jobs, and from the initial questions, it sounds like doesn't look like that the job's going to come back. But if you're looking forward 5-10 years from now, thanks so much. Which specific industries do you think to grow in Ohio, and which ones do you expect to shrink even further going forward?
Okay, I think I probably have maybe a disappointing answer. I don't know the answer to the question, but I would say, again, kind of based on what Mike has mentioned, others have mentioned too, there is research. I mean, given the increasing capital intensity in the manufacturing sector, what it means is you have the skill levels of people in plants. So Mike mentioned the Intel plant. It's higher skilled people typically than what you would have seen in the manufacturing sector a generation ago. So where will we see growth? What entities, what parts of the manufacturing sector will be viable both in Ohio and domestically? Presumably it's the ones that are pretty, pretty capital intensive and likely to have higher skilled workers working for them, which kind of underscores, again, the theme here about if you're preparing and, the work of this institution, if you're thinking about what we can do to support economic vibrancy, vitality, prosperity in the region, it really, it depends very critically on human capital. And the point that Mike's making about Intel citing that plant outside of OSU is right on. I mean, it's both about kind of access to a lot of labor generally, but high human capital labor, spillovers potentially with OSU. It seems like it's an old story that people have been saying, for quite a while, but it's not obvious that that's really shown up in the policy conversation as much as it should, that, really it's critical to invest in the human capital of the nation's workers, the state's workers, to make sure that we're in a good position economically. Mike also mentioned, I think, or alluded to the work of Clark Golden from about a century ago, where, again, you had high-skilled people who could take jobs at a time when there was, transformation in what was happening in the manufacturing sector. You needed sort of flexible skills. The same thing seems to be true at a moment like this.
Makes sense.
The one thing, if I could add,
please.
we talk a lot about gamification of manufacturing. So the younger generation coming in, working in a food manufacturing plant, they don't want to lay noodles all day or whatever it is. So we talk about how can we automate and make it so now they're running a machine off of an iPad, right? And now it's more like a game, something that they would be excited about doing. So that is something that we have also been seeing as we invest in automation. We call it gamification. I don't know if that's a real thing or made up, but
Makes sense.
it's real now.
Well, I have the first batch of the questions, so I'm going to ask any of you guys who feel more comfortable answering these questions to please jump in. Here's the first question. With the recent development of AI programs like ChatGPT, do you foresee any major shift in the labor market like what happened with automation in manufacturing?
Yes.
Would you like to elaborate on that?
I think Mike was going to say something.
No, go ahead.
I mean, I don't have deep thoughts on this other than to say, so Mike showed the slide, and maybe some of you have played around with ChatGPT. It is sort of astonishing. I mean, the point that he was making about panhandling, it doesn't seem wrong to me for a lot of the things that I do on a daily basis. So you think about data analysis, you think about trying to find patterns and trends, writing memos, communicating with colleagues. It seems like a lot of that stuff, communicating with broader audiences, a lot of that stuff seems like it can happen in a way that I don't think I appreciated until, you can start to play with these tools. So we know that professional services firms, other types of, white collar types of entities have been trying to do this kind of back office process automation for a while. It's hard to imagine that this won't accelerate that and really, change the work of what a lot of us in this room do, hopefully not too soon. If you can give me about 10 years, that would be good. But, maybe the other thing to say about it is we've been talking for maybe a generation or two about the impact of automation on the goods producing sector. Now we're going to see it much more, obviously among service producers in particular, often high-skill service producers.
You talked about the bot. I would also say the working from home push. That's one that we have to be really careful on, because the more we can say we can work from home, why would you not export those jobs to other markets where they'll do it for less?
Yeah, that's a valid point.
Yeah, I would say if you're anything that you're doing that is uniquely human, high-end cognitive work, social, emotional connection, those things we always do more of through technology. The bot doesn't do that stuff very well. You can't do a hypothesis test. I actually when I ran ChatGPT, I put in what is the local economic impact of Walmart, which I wrote a book on 15 years ago. Its answer just was awful, right? It flat got one of my papers wrong. Just said I said something I didn't say. And so it will replace some things. If you can put something in it and rewrite it, it's great. So the first time is very human, then the rewriting of it to make it better. So, but we've already been through this. If you try to get onto your local bank, you're talking to AI, right? And I'm just old enough to have programmed on punch cards. And so I don't think AI is going to be quite as shocking to those of you who are students here as the computer has been for me over the past 40 years.
Thank you all. We haven't talked about taxes, and this question is about taxes. Does offering tax incentives boost local manufacturing in a sustainable, long-term fashion? Do you think that we should offer them?
The academic work says unequivocally no. And my 5 or 6 papers on it say the same thing.
All right.
Well, I agree too. There's a recent piece that looks. They've got I think a larger data set that they've put together. Again, people have been looking at this for quite a while, and that comprehensive work suggests that if there are benefits, they tend to be marginal. And again, the higher ROI things tend to be kind of investments in human capital, direct assistance to businesses, things like that.
Makes sense. I'm going to use this opportunity to plug in a paper that I'm working on, and it's recently got accepted. It's going to come out, and what we're looking at is property taxes in Ohio. And we're trying to see if the property taxes changes and goes up, does it have any impact on businesses? And across the board, it doesn't look like it. It doesn't look like that when a school district votes on and gets more taxes on the books, suddenly businesses pick up and move 2 streets down or 2 blocks down to the next district. It doesn't look like that. Basically do not see it. And we look at manufacturing, non-manufacturing is smaller, one-person business, and bigger. We don't really see anything there. So kind of our findings are in line with what we've heard here, which is it doesn't look like businesses are really reactive that much to these taxes. So doesn't make sense to give them any reliefs, because that just means at the expense of our school system, everything else is being funded by our taxes. Well, thank you for this question. Allowed me to talk about my research. All right, again, this is for everyone here. How will Ohio manufacturers justify the investment in automation if our output per capita productivity is already high and the cost of labor will be rising faster than inflation as the new jobs will require college degrees. The economics are challenging and offshoring still looks attractive. So basically, if you're already at the top of our productivity, what would justify investment in manufacturing? Why shouldn't we just go abroad?
There'll be fewer workers.
Okay.
I mean, just simply, right, the people will cost more, there'll be a big investment, they'll be more productive, but the number of workers will drop. That's the ongoing story of automation.
I see. All right. This is about the schools, what I love. Our local public school leaders are promoting an academy model, preparing high school students for lower-end blue-collar jobs. Given the research results, should we be focusing more on promoting college degrees and post-associate education?
It's a challenging one for this reason. I mean, I think people have rightly drawn attention to not thinking maybe in a nuanced enough way about what it means to have a college degree. So I mentioned flexible skills. That's typically, I think, the way that people have thought about college training in the past. So to answer the question, I'm not sure I would want to be focused on degrees, although that's a proxy for thinking about, skill levels more generally. But you could look at college degrees, high school diplomas, et cetera. Really the key is, do you have workers that you can employ? And you want to make sure, I think, that training programs are connected to what they think employers need at the moment, but also preparing maybe through certificate programs or other approaches, preparing workers for the skills that they need currently, but also kind of on an ongoing basis. That, to the first part of the question about training individuals for blue-collar work, it does seem like that might be, the benefits of that training might be short-lived given the changes that, we've been seeing and are likely to continue to see in the sector. So I think it's really about preparing students, with the skills, arming them with the skills that they need. That could come through a college degree. It could come through a training certificate or other sort of credential.
With that, I would add the trade roles at our site in Ohio are the hardest that we have to fill. And those are, because you don't have kids going in, right? Like things like welding, they're not going into that. So we have openings in maintenance. Those types of roles are our hardest by far to fill, and they're open for years. And what we end up doing is taking really good operators, and if they're interested, we have an apprentice program to move them up. So I hear you, but we're always going to need, the trades are still very important.
I agree with that. Anyone else?
Well, I'm not a practitioner, but I talk to a lot of small businesses, so I'm also not an economist. I don't have the stats, but almost every business I talk to is the same way. They've got open positions they can't fill in the trades, whether it's welding, whether it's machine operating, and most of those are taking more skill now. It's not, like you were saying, laying noodles or assembling something simple. It's about being able to run PLCs and computers and things like that. So it does take a certain higher level of training. And every company I talk to, even if they're growing and then their sales are going crazy, they're being limited by the lack of a skilled workforce that can show up to work every day, can do what they need to do. And that's one of the things I think holding back a lot of the economy, whether it's in this region or others, that they can't build something fast enough or enough. So,
I would say I think I agree with everything here. Indiana has just gone through a disastrous experiment with this. So we decided in 2014 that we were going to de-emphasize college, and the share of our adults going to college went from 65 to 53%, which is going to be a millstone around Indiana's neck for 40 years. And so what we should have done is exactly what you just heard described, to say, you don't have to go to a 4-year, you don't have to go to Ball State, you don't have to go to IU. Please don't go to OSU, but you need to do something post-secondarily, and it could be in secondary education. You could get a welding degree. That's equivalent to an associate's degree. You need something past high school if you're really going to be competitive in labor markets today. And so the question isn't, do we need more skilled trades? The answer is, of course we do. What Indiana did was actually sort of indoctrinate 6th graders with career options. The schools had no money, right? So in our school, where my kids went, that meant 6th grade boys were being exposed to truck driving careers. Now, anybody ever been a 6th grade boy before? That sounds great, right? That's what I would have done if somebody given me the option. The problem is that those jobs are going to be gone by the time those young men are 30. Right, and so it was really in the implementation. So, having a really robust community and technical college system, and students at age 18 who can make whatever choice they want. Plumbing is a great choice. Welding is a great choice. Being an economist is a great choice, and all of them pay about the same.
I can attest to that for sure. So the next question, and I think we kind of touched on it, but I'm just going to repeat it in case there is something left that you guys want to add. Can you cite any particularly effective public policy catalysts Ohio should consider? Conversely, are there any policy interventions with adverse impact that you would say we should get rid of?
Well, I mean, I'll stick with the theme and just mention again, higher returns typically to investments in human capital, and there's been a lot of work that's been done over the last 25 years on early childhood education in particular. So that's the point at which you can really have the greatest impact on people's human capital, on their abilities. Human capital is wrong, but shape them. The impact of those investments are greatest then. So that might be the one public policy choice that would be beneficial for us, beneficial for us as a nation if we wanted to adopt essentially more robust, more expansive early childhood ed.
Makes sense.
Yeah, I would say Ohio, like many Midwestern states, leaves a lot of human capital on the table. There are almost everybody could get one more advanced degree. They could get one more skill. Cost is very prohibitive. When you tell high school kids that they should pursue the trades, then it's not going to be my kids that pursue the trades. It's going to be kids who are just as smart as my kids, whose dad's not a professor, right? And so you really ought to expose more children to education earlier, more robustly. The same author who has authored the most important tax incentive work, that's Tim Bartik in Michigan, also authored these early childhood education. So what he's saying is, and this is a review of literature that is widely agreed upon in the profession, is about $1 invested in early childhood education yields about $7 of net benefits over time with that, right? So when you account for the time value of money. If you look at $1 invested in capital incentives, only about the net return, that's about a quarter, right? And so the benefit cost of these two things are very different. One of the incentives that does work is incentive and training to a business. So you give actually a tax incentive to a business to train workers to go back and get that welding degree. That's been a very successful program in a number of states. So policies that focus on the future of the United States is on people. We don't have a capital access problem. We have a human capital access problem. So any policy that merits people in the place that they're at more than the capital is going to matter. And I just point this point because one of the objections to higher education or post-secondary education is we're going to educate those kids and then they're going to leave and go someplace else. That shouldn't be your worry. The worry is that you don't educate them and they stay.
Very valid point. Next question that I have here. So today's conversation was more focused on manufacturing industries in Ohio. What role do service industries in Northeast Ohio play in international market, and what advantages does our region offer to these businesses? I know, Mike, you touched on a little bit about service businesses being a big element of our
Well, take a
region.
jab. So the U.S. actually exports more services than we import. People like American stuff, right? They like Disney for whatever reason, and they like movies that we produce, and they love our higher education, right? And so the one thing that we have seen in manufacturing and the connection to manufacturing is that there's a really interesting study at Nicholas Bloom and some colleagues entitled The Good, the Bad, and the Apocryphal about factory job losses. And they actually tracked factories, and they found that as they went away, about a third of them just changed their industrial classification to service, professional services. So a lot of factories that were operated, had people working on it, a portion of them spun off, and either they provided a direct production service, like they worked on AI, or they worked on maintenance of equipment or vehicles, or they did some other supplementary service like providing HR, export service, something like that to them. So for every that's why the multiplier for manufacturing is large, right? Because they buy so many other sectors as well. It's not just that the people that work there buy things, but businesses source locally a lot. And I'm sure Nestle has a lot of local businesses that you work with every day.
All right. The next question is actually two questions, both of them concerning labor. So I'm going to ask both of them, and you guys choose which one you want to answer, hopefully both. What should the U.S. do in terms of its policy toward immigration, and also its policy to increase job market participation?
Well, on the first, at least, I mean, you can hear it from Jill and Todd on, the challenges that firms have faced in hiring in the last couple of years. So one thing to say about this is when you look at participation rates, where we are with overall participation rates, it's just north, if I remember correctly, of 62%, down from a little over 63% prior to the pandemic. People point to the decline in the participation rate as really showing up as people are electing to stay out of the labor force. That's the reason that it's difficult for firms to hire. That could be a result of pretty generous assistance over the course of the pandemic. I'm sure that there's something to some of that. But if you look at the projections from the CBO prior to the pandemic for where we would be in terms of participation rates, we're right about where they projected. And that's largely all about demographics. But what's missing in there, so that's the participation rate. What you don't see there is the size of the labor force overall. And because of the pandemic, these immigration flows were disrupted. So if I'm remembering correctly, there's work from the UC Santa Barbara where the estimate was a reduction in new workers of something on the order of about 2 million, about half of whom would have had college degrees. This gets very much to the question of immigration more generally, which of course had been diminishing over the course of the last decade. It seems, given our birth rates, given expectations for population growth, it seems straightforward to conclude, that if we want to make sure that, again, we've got workers to support our factories, firms, et cetera, our economy more broadly, it's going to require a little bit more when it comes to a little bit more from outside of the country in terms of supporting the workforce here.
Makes sense.
I have to take a jab at immigration. Almost any policy would be better than what we have now, which is the absence of a decent policy. In the decade prior to 2019, we were net importers of about 4,200 published scientists. So these are scientists that published and had papers cited. So they're sort of the top echelon at that time. In 2021, we had 42 net. Right, and China was at like 148 over that decade. They're now in the thousands. So as long as the world's talent can't come to the United States, they're going to go from where they're unhappy to some other place. And it would be epically stupid for us to permanently lock out people who want to come here with higher education, with better skills. There can be an argument about the low skill. I'll just point out to you that even the most low skilled workers that came to the United States, let's say walked here from Guatemala, their children outperform the United States incumbent workforce the same way that the children of the Irish did who came here in the famine. And so our immigration lockout, which right now is almost exclusively amongst legal immigrants, high-skilled immigrants, is really clobbering us in the short run. But any type of immigration lockdown is a long-term challenge for us. In other countries that are facing the same demographic challenges that we do, which is lower birth rate, aging population, they're going to be relooking their challenges and trying to absorb the world's talent that way. And it's really crazy that we're not doing that. The other thing I'll say is that immigrants are far less sensitive to moving to places like the Rust Belt than are incumbent Americans. And so if you want to revive, I tell this in Indiana all the time, I'm speaking immigration conference in a month in Fort Wayne, a national conference. If you want to fix your place, the best way to start is with bringing in people who are thirsty for opportunity. And that is the quickest way to fix whatever problem you have right now. It should be complementary with other things, but wow, what a opportunity we're leaving on the table.
Thank you. While we are on the topic of workforce, let me ask this question very much related to it. So we have seen wage growth started to lag behind productivity since late 70s. Does this have anything to do with automation or import competition? Or let me open it up a little bit more. Why do you think what is the main reason behind the fact that real wages has not grown as much as the productivity has grown in the US?
I'm not sure that's true. There's a famous graphic that shows that wages have grown more slowly than productivity. But if you look at total factor, so that would just be the growth in GDP per person is growing more slowly than wages. But if you account for the capital inflow with that total factor productivity, which is really what matters, it looks far better than that. And the other thing is our purchasing power has gone way up. So we think if we look just at wages adjusted by the CPI, that doesn't tell the full story. There's a book entitled Superabundance that's out that actually did the time value of what you have to purchase, and it shows stark real wage increases as measured by the amount that I have to shell out to do something to get some good or service that aren't captured well by the consumer price index. That's a lot of inside economics baseball, right? There's always worry about too much monopoly power and things like that, but I think if you're in manufacturing area, your manufacturers are competing globally. These are hyper-competitive industries. It's really, if you're a PhD in economics and you want to work in Akron, you probably have one employer. That's maybe a monopoly. For everybody else, I don't think that's probably a big problem.
Makes sense. All right. So this one is about the gig economy. So during the COVID-19, we had an increase in the gig economy. Do you think this will have an impact, positive or negative, on our competitiveness in the international market? The idea being, usually the gig economy means you kind of can cut back on benefits that you provide, and maybe it makes it a little bit cheaper to use workers in the US. At least that's how I read into this question. But what do you think would be the role of gig economy in terms of increasing or decreasing the competitiveness of US firms?
Well, I'll just offer this. Maybe it's responsive to the question, maybe not. To the extent that people are taking these gig work opportunities because they feel like they don't have the skills to do other things that might be, might pay a higher wage, that obviously seems like a bad thing from a competitiveness perspective, and it goes back to kind of the theme of investments in human capital that we've been talking about. But I guess that's really the assumption there. It could be the case that, you could have a lot of the development of the apps, of course, has happened domestically. So it doesn't have to be the case that people are using gig work. It might be the case that people want the flexibility. It doesn't have to be a bad thing, but to the extent that it reflects a lack of opportunities for other types of work, I mean, that would be the thing to pay attention to, I think.
I see. Anyone else? All right. Let me keep an eye on the clock. So maybe this would be the last question before I have the final question for everyone. So what role can public partners, local and county governments, libraries, and schools play in supporting international trade conversations? What do you think we should have in the schools and libraries especially?
Well, I don't know about libraries and primary schools, but I think one of the things that we're still lacking a lot in Northeast Ohio is a lot of universities that are focused on international trade. There's still not a lot of international business graduates coming out of local universities, so I think we could focus on the global market when you're in a business school. I know Akron has several programs like that, but there are plenty of other schools that don't really even have international business as part of their core. They might have to take one class to get their business degree, but when we're talking about 95% of the world's consumers outside the U.S., if you're getting a business degree, you ought to be able to talk intelligently about the 95% of the world's consumers, right? So I think that is still an opportunity gap that we have, especially some of the statistics we heard earlier about how many foreign-owned companies are in this region, Nestle and plenty of others, which provide great jobs and great opportunities. Well, all those companies work internationally. So if you can provide the education and the ability for some of those folks that are getting their degrees to work for an international company that might have offices in Europe or in Asia, but they're trained and ready to do business in those countries, I think that would be it's still an opportunity that can be taken advantage of.
Makes sense. All right, so let me ask one last question from each one of you. I want to go down the line, and I hope everyone answers this question. What key point from today's conversation would each of you like our audience to take away? Mike, let's start with you.
Yeah, I would go back to the future of the Northeast Ohio area is really going to be linked inextricably to the quality of the human capital here. How well educated are your folks? How prepared are they for jobs, whether it be a welder or a business leader or a gig worker? And that part of that is going to be attracting people through quality of life. The big factors are those going to be how good are schools, how clean is your air, is crime good? And again, that's an opportunity here that I don't think is fully embraced by folks in Northeast Ohio. You've chosen to live here. A lot more Americans could do so in the next generation. And I would think hard about trying to advertise that in both soft and hard ways.
Thank you. Jill.
So I think my key takeaway is I'd love everyone to go by 2 Stouffer's lasagnas, one for tonight, one for this weekend. That would be fantastic. No, I think there is so much greatness in this area when it comes to manufacturing, and how do we speak about that better?
Makes sense. Thank you. Todd.
Yeah, I agree with that too, and I think the one takeaway I'd like to leave everyone with is that, look outside the United States, look for potential market opportunities, even if it is just Canada, and also know that there's resources at your fingertips. Most of them are free. Take advantage of them. You don't have to figure it out yourself. You don't have to fumble through it. There's plenty of people that can help you, whether it's being paid by an overseas buyer, which scares a lot of us when we're running our own company, paperwork, all that kind of stuff. There's plenty of assistance. The rest of the world is already working in that global economy, and I think Northeast Ohio needs to continue to step up and step into that global economy to begin to, or continue to create jobs again in this region. So,
my key takeaway is we should pay more attention to Mike Hicks. That's what I've learned from today's session. I'm only half kidding. Really, I think it does go back to, as we've been talking about, I do think we're sort of at an inflection point. We've been having this conversation really throughout my maybe entire lifetime, certainly my professional lifetime, about manufacturing in this region. What can we do to support and strengthen it? I think that's all fine, but I frankly don't think that orientation has served us well. I really do think, rather than thinking about a sector, this sector or that sector, thinking about our kind of the historical legacy of manufacturing, it's really critical that we think about investments in place, again, of the sort that Mike talked about, but investments in people. Again, as he pointed out, that's part of the reason that people came here in the first place. That's the reason they'll come back here again in greater numbers.
Thank you so much. We are at the end of our time for this panel. Dr. Ghosh has a few concluding remarks that she's going to deliver, but first, let's thank our panelists for their wonderful conclusions. Thank you. Thank you.
I don't know about you, but those 2 hours went real fast, I think. I can't believe it's 5 o'clock already. So this is the time when I start thanking everyone, okay? So just bear with me while I go through this process. But I do want to take a moment to thank some of you who are here. I want to begin with all our gold, silver, and bronze sponsors for their support of the forum. I also want to thank the entire Economics Advisory Board for their support. They back me on a number of initiatives, and I'm truly appreciative of that. And, you know, talking about labor shortages, I have not had an admin for at least a couple of months. You know, great timing, of course. But having said that, I have to give a special shout out to Lajan and Katie back there, who self-volunteered to help me with some of the logistics of the event. So I'm sure you got emails at 10 o'clock at night from Katie on parking. Well, that's because she didn't have to do this, but she said, I'll take care of it for you. So thank you, thank you. I don't know if Katie Willis is here, but if she is, I want to thank you for being so patient with me on the endless proofs and copies we exchanged over the last few months. So thank you. And then finally, I want to thank each one of you for taking the time out of your busy, busy schedules to be here. We know that there are so many economic issues that are fundamental to the economic growth of Ohio, and it's impossible to tackle all of them in one go. However, having said that, our hope is that the Ohio Economic Forum, by addressing one important policy issue every year, will help facilitate this dialogue that moves us forward, not only us in academia, but all of us in our community. After all, we have one common objective, which is to have a thriving economy in Ohio that benefits every individual, every household, every business, and every worker that has chosen to live in Ohio. I hope to see all of you back again next year. Mark your calendar. I'm already ahead of the game. Our next Ohio Economic Forum will be on April 11th, 2024. It's a Thursday, again from 2 to 5, same time. And stay tuned for the topic for next year. Have a wonderful, wonderful weekend, and I hope to see many of you back over here.